we can go ahead and begin. Thank you all so much for everyone who has taken the time today to join us and be here. We are so excited that you joined us from wherever you are. My name is Teresa Somerville, and I am with American Journal Experts, and I work with our authors and to be able to provide resources to help them throughout the publication and writing journey. And today we have with us Emily Marchant from Cambridge University Press, who we're excited to have as partners. And so she will be sharing today about publishing your research and providing different information about that. I will let her share in just a moment a little bit about what she does and about Cambridge University Press. Before I hand it over, though, I do want to let you all know that we will have time for questions and answers throughout this webinar. If you would like to add any questions or ask any questions, we have two different places where that can be done. There's a chat box that on my screen, it's on the right-hand side. And there's also, it's the bottom of my screen, it says Q&A, and where you can also type questions in there directly. So if you have any questions as we go throughout the webinar, you're welcome to ask it at any time. And when we get to those sections, we'll make sure that we, have those questions and I'll be able to make them. Thank you so much for being here. And Emily, thank you so much for doing this webinar today. We're so excited to have you, and I will go ahead and hand it over.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah,
and just let you share.
Sorry, Teresa, there's a bit of a delay on the line.
Oh, no, it's...
I think we may have lost you. I don't know if people are able to hear me, if they could just let us know in the chat box, because then I can just maybe kick off and get us started.
That's great. I can hear you. Can everyone hear us okay? If you will let us know in the chat box. Oh, great. We do have one person that said they were able to hear. Perfect. Yeah, I think we're all set, Emily.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much. And sorry for any technical issues. It's always difficult getting these things set up, but it looks like hopefully we're going to be okay. So let me just introduce myself, and thanks, Teresa, for getting us started there. So I'm Emily Marchant. I work at Cambridge University Press in our academic division, and my job is Author Services Manager. So I look after a whole range of different things relating to academic authorship across books and journals, although I'll be mainly talking about journals today. Can answer questions about books later if anyone has any interesting questions about book publishing. But part of my job is doing webinars like these. So I'll sometimes visit universities and give training courses. I've done training on authorship, but also on peer review for new peer reviewers. And the other big part of my job is working with AJE too. We are partners, as Teresa said, and we work together on providing authors with manuscript preparation services. And so we're just really excited to be able to do this partnered webinar today and I'll tell you a bit about the journal publication process, kind of starting from scratch. And then if you have any more kind of advanced questions, then you're very welcome to ask those and we'll deal with them at the end. I think my slides will take probably around half an hour. So we should have lots of time for questions and discussion. So great. Good to be here. Good to speak to you all. Thanks for joining. And I'll kick off. So let's start. So what I'm going to talk about today is these basic kind of topics around getting your journal article published. And these should really apply to any discipline. So I don't know where most of you are coming from, whether you're STM, humanities, social sciences, but the slides here should really apply across the board because I'm starting from a kind of from scratch really. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to select a journal. When we've done research with authors, we found that this is actually one of the hardest parts of the journey, is figuring out which journal is going to be best to submit to. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing your manuscript, so the stage of getting the research and putting it into its final form as a manuscript ready to go to a journal. That bit we might want to have some discussion about, because it differs quite a lot across the different disciplines. I'm going to talk a bit about preparing your manuscript, so getting it ready once you've written it, getting it ready to submit to a journal, making sure that it has the best chance once it actually goes there. I'm going to talk you through the peer review process and the kind of assessment process that journals use behind the scenes. I'm going to talk a little bit about two kind of more general topics after that, so looking at publishing ethics and the kinds of ethical questions we get asked by authors, and giving you an example of a few case studies. And then I'm going to talk about open access too, because that's obviously a kind of important movement that we're going through right now in the academic publishing world, and it's good to understand it as best you can as an author. So to start with selecting a journal, the first thing I will always say when talking about this topic is that the top reason for an article being rejected from a journal is that it is submitted to one that isn't really appropriate for that research. So this part of the process, while it doesn't maybe seem like it, is hugely important. And I think the way that you can sort of best get through this this part of the process is to really understand a lot about the article that you're trying to write and what you're trying to achieve with that research. So I've got a couple of questions here. Consider, why are you publishing this research? Is it a really novel piece of research in your field? Is it an important contributor to a discussion that's already happening, potentially in a particular journal or in your field in general? And who needs to access that research? Is it, be as specific as you can with yourself about who is going to be interested in that research. Is it for a more general audience in your discipline, maybe in a wider kind of disciplinary sense? Is it much more targeted at a really kind of specialist audience? Really have that in your mind when you're about to start going and selecting a journal to submit to. And then here's some ideas on how to start that kind of assessment process. So I would say your network is going to be a really key advantage here. So anyone that you work with already, maybe people who mentor you or manage you, speaking to them they'll know your research really well. So if they know your research, they can give you better advice on the best kind of home for that research. And then thinking too about the journals that you commonly read and research in. Where did you build your bibliography from for this article? What kind of discussions is it already a part of, in your eyes? And which journals, are you up to date with as a researcher? That's a really good place to start looking. And then building that shortlist and kind of looking at the options from there. I think that those are two really good places to start. So let's talk a little bit about motivations for publishing, if I can get the slides to work. Here we go. So there's some interesting research, and I've got a footnote at the bottom of this slide if you want to go and have a better look. I think we'll be circulating the slides after this, if I'm right, Teresa.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, we
great. So there is a reference down there at the bottom of the slide, and I think this research is really interesting. So in terms of looking at why you're publishing, Cambridge University did some kind of really in-depth ethnographic research with a whole range of different researchers across a whole range of different disciplines at the university. And outlined kind of 4 different motivations for publishing. So, look at yourself and sort of what you're trying to achieve in your career. Do you want to change the world? Are you working on kind of groundbreaking research that's going to solve, problems that are affecting us all? Do you want to mentor your students and kind of bring up the next generation of researchers? Do you want to be, do you want to have full mastery and be expert on one particular area of your field? Or is your work kind of more exploratory and is that your motivation? So those are some kind of that's like a summary of, I suppose, what that research outlined, but there's some really interesting detailed stuff in there about how different research and motivations kind of change the way that people publish. So I really recommend that as a place to go if you're fairly new to publishing, or even if you're experienced and just want to see some recent research. And then in terms of who you want to reach, so I talked a little bit about this in the previous slide, but looking at a broader scope or a more specialized scope. Is your work regional? So if you have a kind of study that is really focused on one area of the world, that's really location specific, then are there journals that suit that kind of region focus, or is your work much more suited for an international audience? That's a really key factor here. Do you want to is there a specific debate that you want to contribute to? That's often, how people come up with the idea for some research in the first place. They're reading a particular discussion that's going on in a journal and they want to contribute to that. So if that's the case, that can help you choose a journal too. And also, what I didn't mention on the previous slide, are there things that you want to be able to do with your article that you need to check? Whether that journal provides. So if for example, your funder wants you to make your article open access, whether that's gold or green, and we'll talk a little bit about open access at the end of the presentation, does that, do the journals that you're looking at actually offer the thing that you need them to do? Okay, so let's start looking at how, once you've assembled that shortlist, what journals should you actually choose? So you've got a few journals, you're trying to think about which one you're actually going to go and submit to. So I want you to think about, first of all, what the editorial board is likely to be looking for. So every journal has a board of academics that is looking at the papers as they come in and establishing whether those papers are going to be right for the journal. And that's really that first line of assessment. So I think here are the kind of key things you need to be doing when you're assessing the journals in your shortlist. Make sure that you read the aims and the scope of that journal, especially the aims and the scope, but I've also got here the manuscript submission guidelines. So finding the journal's homepage on the internet, if it's a journal that you already read, you may already know where that is. If not, usually the journal's website is going to be on a publisher platform of some kind. So for Cambridge, it'd be on Cambridge Core, and really dissect that aims and scope and have a look at the submission guidelines. Make sure that that scope statement that the journal gives out really matches the scope of your article. Again, as I've said before, this is one of the key reasons why your article will get rejected if it doesn't match the scope of the journal in the editorial board's eyes. And then review some recent publications. We don't all have time to be reading in their complete version all of the journals in our area, but if you have a journal on your shortlist and you're not that familiar with the papers, make sure that you have a look at a few, see whether they kind of match, are they on a par with your manuscript, find out any key topics that are covered and how they cover those topics, and just sense check whether that matches the research you're looking to submit to. And then looking at things like the hierarchy of that journal. And this is the really difficult bit. When I've interviewed authors, a lot of them say that this whole process is just a balancing act between trying to get the kind of best impact factor journal with the minimum risk in terms of rejection and therefore delay. So I understand that this is a really difficult kind of judgment to make, but can you, give an honest appraisal of how significant are your findings in relation to the understanding of your discipline as a whole, and trying to choose a journal that matches that kind of level of significance or spread, I suppose, is really key. And then, as I said before, there's some stuff that you're going to be looking for too out of the journal, so don't forget that. So what is the journal's policy on peer review? Are you happy with that? We'll talk about peer review models in a second, but do you want your peer reviews to be open? If that's a really key thing for you, you're going to need to look for journals that offer that, and the same with open access. And does the kind of slightly related to open access, access if you have any requirements placed upon your research from either from your institution or your funder. Does your journal allow you to comply with those? So most often when I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about kind of green open access and depositing your manuscripts post-publication. Does the journal allow you to comply with that? As publishers, we're working quite hard on trying to be as compliant as we can with our policies, but sometimes there is still a mismatch. So making sure that you look at that too. And then are there going to be any fees? So if you're publishing open access, for example, there might be an article processing charge. Can you find that information on the journal homepage? Are you happy with how much that is, and are there any other fees that are going to be charged that you need to know about prior to choosing? Some strange things going on with my slides, apologies for that. Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about predatory journals too, because I think it's really important to cover this. This is a kind of growing problem that we're seeing in the field. For those that don't know what predatory journals are, these are journals that are not legitimately kind of academic homes for research, but really instead they've been kind of created, they're kind of false journals that are mainly created so that whoever is sort of running that can extract fees from authors. And unfortunately, even though open access is a kind of very legitimate, model for publishing, the rise of open access has also kind of precipitated this rise in predatory journals, because it's more common now that legitimate journals will ask for article processing charges or APCs, and so that's kind of laid the ground for the possibility of illegitimate journals doing the same. Often these journals will appear to be legitimate. For example, they might email you sort of seeking submissions. They might choose names that are really similar to actual journal titles, reputable journal titles, and they might even claim to have eminent academics on their editorial boards. There's been some news recently that even some eminent academics have kind of sort of, I suppose, fallen for the one of the illegitimate journals and agreed to be on the editorial board, for example, even though it's not a legitimate research publication. So, and usually these journals are claiming to be open access, as I've said, in order to charge you fake APCs. The difference being that they then either won't publish your research or they won't publish your research in the way that they've promised to do so. So just some advice on how to avoid this, because it is something that we're seeing fairly commonly these days. The main thing is check whether the journal that either that you found or that's contacting you is indexed somewhere like Scopus or the Web of Science or any of the kind of reputable citation databases. That's one way of looking into this. I would say use that as a kind of a basic check for every journal that you submit to, but then also on top of that, do some other kind of digging if you're not familiar with the journal. So there's a great website called thinkchecksubmit.org, which gives you a kind of a useful checklist. For example, do your colleagues know the journal already? Do you know the journal already? That can help. But obviously in the case of new journals, you may not. Is it clear, what you will receive in return for the fees that are being charged? Do you recognise the editorial board? Is the publisher, this is a kind of interesting one, is the publisher a member of any recognised industry initiatives? So for example, there's an industry body called the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, and most reputable journals will be a member of that. Now, none of these are a kind of a guarantee that a journal isn't predatory, but they're just good ways of kind of gathering information on that journal. So do think about this when you're submitting, and ask around. I think that's often the best way of figuring out whether a journal is legitimate. So moving on to writing. So we have what we call the ABC of effective writing at Cambridge: accuracy, brevity, and clarity. So let's start with accuracy. So by the time that you submit your manuscript, and all of this is about kind of where to get your manuscript before you submit it. So by the time you submit your manuscript, it should be pretty ready to go. It should be complete. you know, it's kind of not ideal to be sending any kind of edits or amendments to your article after you've submitted it. So make sure it's kind of in the place that you want it to be. Having a look at those manuscript submission guidelines. So I mentioned this in the context of selecting a journal, but actually this is the point where you're going to want to really be looking at those. So you know, does the journal have any specific requirements on sections you need to include, like ethics statements, for example? Have you made sure that, you know, you're submitting everything that's being asked for? Checking your references and checking your data is correct is a kind of final check. Those are kind of commonly the places where we'll see kind of issues that have crept in during the writing process. Focusing on the correct use of grammar and spelling. And I know we have quite a lot of people attending internationally today. So if you're a non-native speaker of English, we also recommend, if you've got any peers that speak English particularly well, they could have a read through your work. Or if you know it's going to be, the language in your article is likely to be a problem, you can also consider using language editing services as well. We offer one, Cambridge and AJE together, but there are lots available. So yeah, having a think about that too, if you're submitting to an English speaking journal, but you're a non-native speaker of English. Brevity, so conciseness is great, and getting to the point. So we always say that a longer manuscript is not necessarily a better one, and that, you know, that if you follow the kind of journal, the disciplinary conventions of structure, that's really helpful in kind of getting to the point and guiding editorial board, peer reviewer, and then reader through your article, and writing as simply as possible, so that that research is more easily communicable with your audience, especially when it comes to things like impact and discoverability. Good writing really does make a difference. So if you can get your message across as clearly as possible, you know, write a good abstract, which I'll talk about in a second, that's going to be really helpful in, you know, maximizing how many people read your article once it's published. And clarity. So this is all about structure, really. I think having a clear message in your abstract can really help to get that across to the journal when you submit, but also you know, looking at the conventions of structure in your discipline. The suggested structure I've got here is really quite science focused. So that kind of introduction, methodology, results and discussion, kind of that classic structure. There may be a different convention in your discipline, depending on where you're coming from. So just making sure that, you know, the way that you present your research is familiar, structure-wise, and that can really help in getting that message across as clearly as possible to the journal and then later to your readers as well. So I'm going to talk about preparing your manuscript now. So the parts, you know, putting together the parts of your manuscripts that you need when you submit. So let's talk about titles. So there's some research, again, I've quoted this on the slide, that shows that articles with shorter titles are viewed and cited more frequently. I mean, obviously this is a rule of thumb, but there's also some research saying that around 16 words should be the maximum length of a title, but you also need to give clear context. So some kind of tips here around leaving out filler words such as evidence of, effect of, comparison of, and then avoiding abbreviations. And I've got an example here. So, and I think actually this is an AJE example, but here's a first draft title, you know, effects of ultraviolet light on spontaneous chromosome rearrangement in red hens when exposed to ultraviolet light. So obviously that's pretty long. Actually, you can say the same thing in around half the words. So ultraviolet light induced chromosome rearrangement in red hens. And, you know, that clearly gets across what the article is about, but it avoids any kind of filler words. It's nice and short. And I think that research, you know, it's linked specifically back to views and citations. So getting your title right is really going to help in how many people actually click on your article. And I'm sure it will also help in that kind of assessment process by the journal too. So let's talk about abstracts. There's a lot of information on abstracts, and there's a slide at the end of my presentation that links you back to AJE's Author Resource Centre, which is fantastic on all of these points, but there's an especially good article on how to write an abstract. But your abstract really just needs to be clear and informative. You need to summarise everything that's in your paper, so the main sections of your paper and what each of them kind of lead up to or conclude, and then make sure that you're kind of talking about any particularly significant findings, that you know, how does your research contribute to the discussion in your field, and then just making sure that your abstract fits the word count stated in the submission guidelines. In most cases, if it's an online submission, that will be kind of imposed, so you won't be able to type in any more information than the stated word count, but in some cases that won't be right. So it's always good to just check those guidelines and make sure that you're adhering to them. And then let's talk a bit about keywords, because most journals will ask you for these when you submit. So these are usually submitted within the text of your article, and they'll ask you to do that in the manuscript submission guidelines on the journal page, but sometimes you'll be submitting them separately in an online submission system. So you know, you might be putting them in various different places, but in both of those cases, what these are is a way for readers to find your article once it's published. And so you need to be thinking about, you know, as the author of your article, you're the kind of best person to choose 4 to 8, and the journal will usually ask for a number, the most applicable words or phrases that somebody might be searching for if they're the ideal reader for your article. So what might people be searching for basically on, you know, an online search engine if they want to find your article and find the research that you've done? A good way of brainstorming for this is asking your peers, and also some journals have kind of lists of suggested or preferred terms that you can look at too. But this is a really, it might not be key in getting your paper accepted, but it's a really good thing to spend a little bit of time thinking about, because if your paper is published, it's got a really big effect on, you know, how easily found your paper is going to be. And then let's talk about cover letters. So you'll be submitting your abstract, your manuscript, some keywords, some information about yourself, and then you may, and in most cases, you'll also be expected to submit a cover letter. So this is kind of, in some ways, a little bit similar to your abstract, but it's more focused on, you know, directly speaking to the editorial board at the journal, where your abstract is helping readers to figure out what your article is about, and your cover letter is really about why your article should be published in that journal. So you're going to want to highlight your most important findings and the significance of them. You're going to want to, and this is very different to your abstract, in the cover letter you're going to want to describe, you know, after having read the aims and scope of the journal, why is your manuscript a good fit for it? And also, one convention is that you probably should also state that the manuscript has not been published elsewhere, and you may also want to state that you haven't submitted the manuscript elsewhere too, in the cover letter, just to kind of make sure that the journal's aware of that. In general, it's written like a standard letter. I've given some suggestions on structure here, so starting with the major findings, moving on to that aims and scope discussion, and here you might want to include a link with any other articles that you've read in the journal, and then closing with a statement that the manuscript is original and hasn't been published before, and as I've said, is not under consideration for publication in another journal. So it should be fairly straightforward, but it's one of those things that probably takes quite a while to you know, think through the key things to convey, but then you're going to want to have it nice and brief and just cover those key points. Great, so moving on to peer review, and I'm probably going to talk for maybe like 10 more minutes. As usual, I've kind of talked a little more than I had planned, so I'll talk until for about 10 more minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, because I do just want to cover peer review and then a little bit about open access too at the end. So why do we peer review? This is probably, you know, fairly apparent. I do like to cover it because, you know, it's such a long-standing tradition that sometimes we forget the reasons for it. So we want to ensure that your article is sound, you know, scientifically. If it's a science article, we want to make sure that you're kind kind of citing the correct things and citing as much as you need to for the particular topic that you're talking about. Reviewers are going to give you some constructive feedback. So actually, peer review is a really important process in improving the research that eventually gets published. We want to alert you to any errors. For some authors, it's quite a positive experience in that it creates a discussion around the research with usually fairly eminent and experienced colleagues in the discipline. And then just making sure, so if for some journals, the peer reviewers will look at whether the journal article matches the scope. We tend not to ask our peer reviewers to do that because we feel like that's a kind of editorial board decision. But in some cases, that will be what your peer reviewers are looking for. Just covering the types of peer review. So these are mainly about who knows whose identity. So single blind and double blind differ in the sense that the author in both cases doesn't know who the reviewer is. But the reviewer in a single blind situation knows the author's identity. And in double blind, they don't. So the author's information will have been removed from the manuscript before the reviewers are asked to assess it. Those two tend to be split across science and the social sciences and humanities, although there's definitely examples of both across all disciplines. So single blind is usually used for science and double blind is usually used for social science and humanities. And then I do like to mention open review. We are doing some experiments on that at the press at the moment with that. So that's where everybody knows everybody's identity. So the author and the reviewer know who one another are. There's a growing number of journals that are doing this with the argument that, open review leads to more honest and accurate review. There are arguments against it too. So, there are pros and cons to each of these approaches. And then in some cases, the review itself will be published. So, everyone will know everyone's identity, plus the review will be published at the end so that readers can see it. So there's lots of variations here. And that, that comes down to kind of a choice for each individual journal that's usually made by the editorial board according to what's most appropriate for that community. Just to whiz through exactly what happens. So once you've gone through all of those steps that I just talked about, so you've selected a journal, you've written your manuscript, you've prepared the manuscript for submission. Once you've submitted it, here's what happens. So the editor, that first sort of central blue circle at the top, the first thing that will happen is that the editor of the journal will kind of do a screening. And if the article is deemed to be, not relevant for the scope of the journal, or immediately it's apparent that it's not kind of a good fit, then that it could be rejected at that point, and that's what we call a desk rejection. So I guess from the editor's desk, the article is rejected. If it's not rejected, the editor will then pass it across to review. You can see that yellow circle in the middle, and then there's a lot of back and forth between the kind of authors, editors, and the reviewers at this point. So the reviewers will give a kind of initial report back to the editor. The editor will look at those reviews and assess them. Sometimes they'll pass on a kind of summary of the reviews to the author. Sometimes they'll pass on the whole review back to the author, and that will differ across different journals. And then the author is kind of responding to that. So I've put author makes revisions here, but actually sometimes the author is, going back to the editor and saying, this is why I'm not going to make those particular revisions. So there is a discussion about what revisions are going to be made to the article as a result of the reviews. And then those revisions could be minor or major. Minor revisions tend to be about, adding in a few new citations, maybe changing the discussion of your results slightly. Major ones tend to involve things like bringing in whole new topics, or even sometimes, doing further experiments, for example, or collecting further data. And then once that kind of process shakes out, that's when we'll get the decision on whether the article is accepted or rejected. So if it's accepted, there's usually some revisions to be made either way. And then if it's rejected, there might be a couple of different responses that you get. And this is the blue box on the right. So it might be a revise and resubmit, i.e. we like the shape of the research, we think it could be useful for the journal, but there is quite a lot to be done to get it there, and so resubmit to us when you've done that. You may get suggestions for another journal to submit to, you may get an outright rejection, and you may get rejection for a particular aspect. For example, you know, the editorial board feels that the language needs to be edited before it can be assessed kind of appropriately. So I've kind of just talked through these bits. So what this slide is about, what constitutes minor and major revisions. And one thing to really pull out from this slide, even though I'm going to kind of skip through the majority of it, is a revise and resubmit shouldn't be seen as a rejection. So if the journal comes back to you and says, you know, please resubmit to us after making these major revisions, they mean it. You know, they would just outright reject the paper if they weren't interested in it. So we see a lot of authors who think that that's a rejection, but actually it's not. It's quite promising that if you come back with the revisions that are requested, that the article may be published by the journal. So this slide is about coming back to reviewers, and I usually dwell on the part at the bottom. So when you're responding to reviewers, just make sure that you might want to actually write a cover letter. So it's a little bit like submitting an article. So I would, the second bullet point here, so having that detailed response, so cover the issues that the reviewers have raised point by point in your article, you know, referring to the line numbers and the actual parts of your article that they are commenting on, and you can do that in sequential order or in like thematic order, and that's fine, or you can do it on the article or on a separate document. That's also fine, as long as it's kind of clearly referenced. But then on top of that, you know, write a responding to review cover letter. So give a thank you to the editor and the reviewers, and just summarize the kind of really key changes that are being made to your article in response to those reviews, and then you can refer to the detailed changes that you've put together as well. And then if you disagree with some comments, it's important to remember that reviewers don't know everything. So if there are some things that you think, actually that's just really not appropriate for my research, or it doesn't, you know, it doesn't kind of, it doesn't seem necessary from what you know about the article that you're writing, you can come back and say, you know, that you do disagree. I would just say that the tone of that is really key. So responding objectively and professionally, and making sure that you support that disagreement with plenty of evidence is really, really key. And even if you do disagree with it, you might decide that you want to revise it anyway, just in case when your article is published, readers have a similar response. So it is a judgment call. But yeah, just to say that it can be appropriate to disagree with reviewers. You shouldn't feel like you have to make every single revision, but kind of disagreements should be carefully considered and responded to kind of objectively as possible. And then there's some examples here, which you'll be able to see when Teresa circulates the slides. And I've also got some, I'm not going to go through these in detail because I do want to leave time for questions, but one of the places that we get a lot of our information on the ethics of publication is the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. And there's a reference to it in these slides later too. And I was going to go through some case studies here around different kinds of ethical issue. So things like duplicate submissions to 2 different journals, plagiarism, what a conflict of interest is, any kind of use of copyrighted materials. But I'm not going to go through it in detail because I think we're running out of time a little bit. I would just urge you to look at the COPE website, the Committee on Publication Ethics website. It's a really great resource for if you're having a kind of an ethical issue, you're not exactly sure how to tackle it. There's a lot of advice on there for authors and researchers, and there's a lot of case studies on there too. So as a publisher, we also use them, you know, quite heavily as a resource in deciding what to do about particular ethical cases. And so I always just like to say, you know, COPE is a great resource. Oh, there we go. I knew there was a reference in there somewhere. So yeah, there's a link there on the slides, and I really do urge you to have a look at that. And so lastly, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about open access. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this already, but there are two different types of open access called gold and green. And I'm just going to run through that kind of that difference, and then maybe if there's any questions, we can go into those afterwards. So gold open access is the one that you probably think of first when you think of open access. It's the idea of funding or an APC, an article processing charge, coming from the author's side, so whether that's their funder, their institution, or the author themselves, to pay in order that the article is made open access to readers straight away. So in terms of access, it constitutes, there's free public access to the published article straight away. That's that first box on the top left. There's different licenses kind of applied to open access work in this form, depending on the journal. So that will be in the journal submission guidelines, and there is a fee, as I've mentioned, and that's called an APC. Usually that's paid by a funder or an institution, sort of depending on the discipline that you're functioning in. That's less common in the humanities and in some social sciences. And then in terms of how you publish OA, so to publish gold open access, you need to be publishing in a journal that offers this option. Most journals now do. Most journals offer a hybrid option that we publish, so they are a subscription journal, but you can make certain articles in that journal open access, gold open access. And then the other option is to publish in a fully gold open access journal, of which there are increasing numbers, including some that we publish. But you would have to choose a journal that offers gold open access in some form in order to publish gold. In terms of green, this is free public access too, but it's not paid for by the kind of research side or the funder. What happens is the article is published as normal, and then most publishers require a certain amount of time post-publication called an embargo period. But then after that period, the author is free to deposit a version of the manuscript or the published article somewhere where it's made open for reading by other researchers. So in a lot of cases, this will be something like an institutional repository or a subject repository. Some publishers, so we're looking into this at the moment, some publishers will be making articles green open access on their publisher platforms after a certain amount of time. But the key thing to remember here, and the difference is that there's no APC, but there is a period of time post-publication that article is not open access, and it's only made open access after a certain amount of time. So you can make most articles in most journals green open access after a certain amount of time. It just depends on the journal's policy on that embargo period. So unlike with Gold OA, you don't have to be publishing in a particular journal that offers it. Because you're going to be depositing the article in maybe an institutional repository or disciplinary repository after publication. So it's worth checking the journal guidelines, but in most cases, green open access is available to you wherever you publish. It's just that there will be that embargo period that you'll have to look at, and that will typically be on the journal homepage. And then I'm just going to skip through the stuff about Cambridge University Press. I wanted to just talk a little bit about author services. So we have a really good website called Author Hub, which has some nice resources for authors. It's focused quite a lot on book authors, but there is also a link to a page that we have with journal author resources, guides and things like that. Feel free to check that out. I've also talked here about our manuscript preparation services that we offer with AJE, and there's a screenshot there of the website. And then I just really want to call attention to AJE's Author Resource Centre. It is fantastic. So if you have any questions about any of the topics in this presentation, and you want to learn a bit more or kind of dive in a bit deeper, they have some brilliant resources, some writing templates, there's videos there. There's, you know, you can search on particular topics. For example, if you're trying to write your abstract and you want to get some guidance. So really, definitely check that out. It's great. It's really, really great. Yeah, so apologies for talking for 15 minutes more than I promised, but let's dive into questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for that great information explaining the differences between open access, and yes, thank you for mentioning our Author Resource Center. So as Emily said, we do want to be able to answer any questions that you all have specific to the publishing process or any of the information that she has covered, peer review or anything of that nature. So if you have questions, I said at the beginning, but you may have joined a little bit later, if you do have questions, there should be a chat box option. On my screen, it's on the right hand side, and then there's also a Q&A box at the very bottom. So we'll give you guys just a minute to add any that you may have. It doesn't look like any are coming through. Emily, I don't know if we want to wrap up or if you want to share any, maybe some, I was going to say, I know that you covered a lot, and so this probably addressed some of the more common questions that you receive or that we get. So we can either give it another minute or we can go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, let's give it a minute. If anyone does have anything, then feel free to ask. No question is a stupid question, and I'm always interested to hear what people, you know, what people struggle with. So even if you don't have a question, any comments that you have on, you know, what you found hard when you're publishing, you know, what are the biggest challenges, what are the most confusing areas of the publication process for you? That stuff is always really, really interesting to hear. And then, yeah, if there isn't anything, then happy to wrap up and let you all get on with your days, whatever time zone you're on, your days, your evenings, your afternoons.
Okay, it looks like we had, great, thank you. Thank you for sending this through. It looks like we have someone that asked, should you argue your response in the detailed response letter with references, or just tell the direct point and direct the reviewer and editor to the manuscript?
So I think the question is about sort of how detailed to get in your detailed response to the review. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a rule for this. I think it kind of depends what you're trying to achieve with that response. So if it's a situation where you are maybe disagreeing with some of the comments in the review, or you know, there's a reason why you made a particular decision that you want to in your article that you want to kind of refer to, it's perfectly appropriate to cite the evidence for that. I guess I would say that would be maybe an exception. So in the majority of cases, you know, you're really going to be focusing on the manuscript, and in terms of your detailed response, you know, the references in there are back to your manuscript. That was what I meant on that slide. So yeah, the discussion is mainly going to be about the reviewer comments in your manuscript and those kind of two documents or two kind of pieces of information. But yeah, if there are particular areas where you feel like you need to bring in more evidence, or you need to kind of back up what you're saying, then it's perfectly appropriate to reference other things in that detailed response. I would just say, you know, keeping it as focused as possible. So I wouldn't do that unless you really feel like it's necessary. And I would question that if you're bringing in other references at that point, you know, should they go into the article? If something requires further explanation, maybe it is a good point to add something new to the manuscript. I hope that helps. It's a little bit rambling.
No, great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Emily. And we do have a couple of other questions, so thank you all for adding these in. So the first one is, which editorial would you recommend to someone who excuse me, let me start over. Which editorial would you recommend to someone who first publishes a piece?
I wish I could help. I wish I could give you a kind of a clear response to that. I think it's really, really difficult to say without knowing your research. And so I would go back to some of the stuff that I was saying in those earlier slides around speaking to your colleagues. Just because it's your first article, that doesn't mean it's not it doesn't mean that you're not ready to publish it somewhere really great or really wide ranging. It just so depends on the research itself. And so while most people, in kind of early career stages are probably going to be looking at journals with maybe less of a reach, or maybe considered less kind of high impact in their area, that isn't a rule. And so I would say it's less about focusing on your career stage and more about focusing on the research and kind of what you've kind of uncovered with that research, and where is the best fit for that. One thing that I think can really help while you're early in your career is getting involved in, if there's anything available to you, like a journal club or an opportunity to help your more senior colleagues with peer review. I think that can give you a really good insight sort of early on in your career into the kinds of assessment that are happening behind the scenes at a journal. So I think probably everyone's familiar with what a journal club is, but I'll just explain for those who aren't. So in some cases, groups of junior researchers will get together and they'll go through recent interesting papers in their discipline together, and assess them and look at them from a kind of almost like a reviewer viewpoint, to learn a little bit more about their discipline and the kinds of things that should be considered, and to learn from each other. And then helping a senior colleague with review can be a really good source of kind of similar information, as long as when that review is submitted to whatever journal it's for, it's made clear that you helped with the review, and you get permission to do that. So yeah, I think those are a couple of tips for when you're early in your career and you maybe it's not as easy to figure out where the best home for your research is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Yes, and I think this is great. We do have another one. I think this is a great question. I've actually never seen this question in any of our webinars. They have asked, how important is the cover letter? I've heard that editors don't actually read it in a very thorough way.
I think you're probably, part of the reason why I was explaining that it should be really focused is that it's not going to be kind of the key thing that's used to assess your research. That really is your manuscript, your abstracts, the details that you give during the submission. I think what the cover letter does is it's a little bit like a job application. So when you write a cover letter for a job application, it's kind of similar. You'll get some HR departments that read the cover letter in detail, and that's a really key part of their assessment. And you get a lot of places that don't, and they just want it as a kind of a summary, I suppose, of your application. And so I think you should probably assume that the cover letter will be read, but I would say it's really key to keep it really brief, so that, even if somebody is glancing at it, you've stated right up front, like, this is what my research is doing, this is what the significance of it is, and this is why I've submitted it to your journal. And if they can see that at a glance, that's brilliant. I think when you get into like really detailed discussion of those topics, that's where that it's probably not going to be used in as detailed a way by the editorial board, just because that like all of us, they're operating under quite a lot of time pressure. So Yeah, I would say there's going to be a variety of different approaches at different journals, but keeping that cover letter brief and making sure that it is a tool for someone who is maybe time pressed and is going to just quickly glance at it and just needs to know, you know, the basics of how your article fits their journal. I would see it as that kind of tool. But you're right that there will be some cases where, you know, that's less of an important factor, and some cases it's where it's considered to be more important. And unfortunately, there isn't any kind of rule across the board.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think that's I think all of these questions are great. And so thank you guys for submitting these. Thank you for, again, for being here this morning. It looks like we have another question that came through. Do we have time for one more, Emily?
Definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so someone said, for some journals that receive articles online, apart from requesting a cover letter, they also give a space for comments to the editor. Are they the same?
Yeah, I think you would probably be, well, no, I don't think they are the same. I think your cover letter is what I've described in terms of your article, its significance, and how it fits the journal. Sometimes that editorial comment box, it's kind of used for like a whole variety of different things that you might not want to put in your cover letter. For example, in some cases, a journal will allow you to comment on things like if there are particular reviewers that shouldn't be used, or if there are particular reviewers that you prefer aren't used, if there are any kind of circumstantial things that you need the editor to know about the article that you're submitting. So, I mean, again, I'm sorry that there isn't a rule of thumb here, because our editorial boards, you know, it's wonderful. There's a huge variety of different kind of approaches and kind of rules in terms of how they assess things, and that tends to reflect the variety of communities that we publish for. But yeah, I would say your cover letter really just needs to hit those key points. That editorial comment box is probably a better place for things like, you know, any circumstances you need them to know about. If there's, for example, a time issue with getting your manuscript published, if there are particular reviewers, if you have any kind of comments or questions about the way that the article was submitted. So, for example, if you think you've done everything correctly, but there was something that you were unsure about, and you want to ask at the point of submission, you could put it there. So I'd use that for more of the kind of logistical queries and comments, and I would use your cover letter more as that kind of formal statement of your research and how it fits the journal, I suppose, in the majority of cases. But I mean, you know, both of those are going to be looked at and used. So I think it's not necessarily the end of the world if you have done things in a slightly different way when you submit an article. That's fine too.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I was going to say, it does look like we've had two other questions come through. We can either answer those, or I do know that we have resources for at least one of those on the Author Resource Center. I was going to say, but I know we're kind of right here at the hour. So what works for you on time, Emily?
Oh, I can just answer them. That's fine by me. Yeah.
Okay.
Lose some people. I know that people have probably got places to go.
Perfect. Okay. So the first one is how to write an effective abstract. And then the second one, and I can ask the second one again in a minute, but it says, what is the main reason to have your manuscript rejected? So maybe the most common reason. So the first one is how to write an effective abstract. And the second one is what are some of the most common reasons manuscripts are rejected?
I think your abstract, I'm definitely gonna, if that's the resource that you were pointing to for that question, Teresa, I think that's probably what I would say too, because there is a really, really good, I think there's like more than one thing, but I know that I've read a great article on abstracts on the AJE site. So we should definitely send that across. But yeah, I think the abstract, I know I kind of skipped over it a little bit in the slides. I guess a good abstract should really uncover, I mean, if you imagine as a reader, what you really want to know at the point that you read the abstract is exactly what's covered in that article. You don't want any surprises. You kind of basically want the abstract to totally uncover what the research is, how it was done, and the basics of what it found. And so I think the abstract is just an opportunity to do that. So I think if you've written a good article, generally it's easier to write the abstract, because if you've structured your article really well, you should probably already know how to boil down the key points from each of the sections. I think it's easier, maybe like a little bit harder if you're working in the humanities and social sciences, or the softer social sciences, to do this if you're not working with data and kind of results. And in those cases, I would probably say, when you are doing your research, if you notice any particularly good abstracts, just, you know, file them away and keep them, and then have another look at them when you come to write yours. For example, you know, asking yourself a question like, this was particularly effective because it gave me the opportunity to figure out what was in the article without having to read the article, you know, and you're basically helping your reader make a decision about whether or not they want to go on and read the full thing. And so if you find abstracts that have done that really effectively for you as a researcher when you're doing the research, and reading other people's work, then I would definitely take a moment to notice that, maybe file them away and take a look at them again when you're writing your abstract. And then another way to kind of develop that skill is asking for, you know, feedback from your peers. I keep talking about that, but I really do think that I really do think that your peers are a really good, and other colleagues, they're a really good resource for kind of testing the work that you're doing on the kinds of people who are going to be reading your research. And so definitely, you know, do your best to try and get their advice too. And you know, that can be a reciprocal effort. So, you know, you can help each other out with that. Yeah. So I think beyond what I said in the slides, it's really just remembering that the abstract is supposed to be a tool to help a reader figure out if they want to read the whole thing, and so it's about uncovering those kind of key boiled down elements of whatever research you're submitting, and then definitely go to the AJE article about this because it's great.
Great, thank you. And I did share in there, we have 2 resources. One is on 6 tips for writing a strong abstract and making a good impression. And the second resource is on how to reduce your word count in an abstract. And so I did drop those links in the chat box for anyone who is interested as well. And then the second question that we had, Emily, was what are some of the main reasons or most common reasons that manuscripts are rejected?
So definitely that first one. So just that the research isn't kind of appropriate for the journal. And in a way, I mean, that's a frustrating thing because, you know, we're always trying harder and harder to try and put across the way that the editorial board are going to make that decision to authors in the journal aims and scope. But sometimes it's just really difficult to judge, and so you know, that rejection that happens early on, I think it's so common, and I always want to stress that so that it doesn't kind of feel, it's just difficult to communicate the aims and scope of something to people easily, and so those kind of early rejections are not necessarily about the quality of your research. They're often about just a kind of basic fit issue, and then when things get further down the line, I think, you know, you're looking at quite different things across different disciplines, but in general it's going to be you know, depending on the journal, the results are not seen as being significant enough, or they don't build on the research in the way that the journal is looking to. And so you might be looking for a home for the research that's more about publishing reproducibility studies and things like that. Or you know, the discussion of the results. There is a gap between the data that was obtained and then the kind of the conclusions that were drawn from that data. So kind of basic kind of mismatch between the conclusions drawn and the evidence sought. I think that's quite a common problem or a thing to be discussed, and that would constitute quite a major revision. So in a lot of cases, then, you know, that would lead to a rejection. But I mean, there's as many reasons as there are articles, and I'm not actually sure what the most common things are. I would be curious to know that myself. I'm sure it varies across the different disciplines. So yeah, I don't actually know what I wouldn't be able to give you a kind of statistical rundown of what the reasons for rejection are. Definitely though, the most common thing is that desk rejection, that you know, where the research doesn't necessarily fit the scope of the journal.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So I think this has been good, and then it's great because I think we continue to kind of have these questions trickling in. We do have one more question. We can make this our final question if that works.
Okay.
Family.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
And we do. I will go ahead and say, or actually, it says how can we write a good discussion? And can we add self-made figures into the discussion? I will say we do have, again, on the Author Resource Center, different resources on being able to write different sections of a manuscript. So I will find that and drop it into the chat as well. But just wanted to share that final question with you. How can we write a good discussion? And are we able to add figures, self-made figures, into the discussion?
So let's talk about figures first. Definitely, you know, the majority of articles, I think, especially in the sciences, will have figures that you've made yourself, and that's if you can represent something visually in your article that you know, that's difficult to represent in sort of linear text, then that's great. I mean, we would always encourage that. It's a great tool for your reader. It kind of, you know, makes the article more interesting and enriches it. So definitely look into figures if that's a good way of representing the kind of discussion that you're writing. And I know AJE does a ton of work on figures. And again, I'll cite the Resource Centre, which has, you know, you can click on the figures as a topic, I think, and find articles relating to that, and resources relating to that. And then in terms of writing a good discussion, I think the important thing is it needs to stay really grounded in the data that you've collected and the evidence that you have. So that's obviously the kind of basic, you know, that's the basic requirement, is that the conclusions that you're drawing and the discussion that you're kind of presenting in the article needs to be really tied back to the your methodology and the limitations of that methodology, as well, and the data that you've collected. And so always keeping that in mind. And then I think in terms of making that discussion kind of rich and as useful as possible, again, I really can't stress enough, like the advice that I'm always giving is, you know, make sure that you've spoken to peers and colleagues. You know, if you're doing that research with others and you're preparing that article with maybe a number of co-authors, or you know, you've collected that data in a lab or a research group, then, you know, the discussion is a kind of, it's a written version and a boiled down version of the kinds of interesting directions that that data and that evidence can take the field in. And so while it should remain rooted in the data and the methodology that you used, you know, it's basically, you could see it as a distillation of the kinds of conversations that you would have about that data in your research group or your lab, you know, things like where could this go next, you know, what couldn't we cover with our methodology, and therefore what opportunities are available after, you know, based on our data and our research, to do more research. What do we think this can tell us, and what assumptions have we based that on? So kind of, you know, the kinds of things that you would discuss when deciding where to take that data and that research in your lab or with your peer group. So yeah, I'd say keeping it rooted in the evidence and the methodology, but making sure that you kind of examine the various strands of discussion that have come out of that research and try and distill them onto the page, without making, with always attention to the kind of assumptions that discussion is based on, and the limitations of the methodology that you use, because, you know, every set of data will have sort of caveats and limitations attached to it, and it's good to keep those at the forefront as you make any conclusions. I hope that's helpful. I'm not a science researcher. My background is in humanities, and so this stuff is, I've sort of learned more of the science side of things while I'm publishing over the last sort of 6 years or so. But I know that I bet the resource centre has some good tips on kind of writing those conclusions and discussions as well in your article.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, I was just looking through. We do have different articles on the different sections in a manuscript. I didn't see one that specifically called out discussions, but as you said, we do have articles that address a variety of sections and materials and methods and introduction, cover letter, abstract. So we do, and then we also have an email address on our Author Resource Center, where you can write in if you do have specific questions. And as Emily did mention, we do actually have a number of articles on figures as well, that are great resources, and we have a couple of videos, or at least one in particular that I can think of. So yes, do feel free to take a look at those if you have further questions. So thank you so much to everyone who attended today. Thank you so much, Emily, for taking time to be able to share this information. And thank you all for all of you who submitted questions. This was a great discussion, and it's really great to be able to hear the questions that you all have and be able to address those directly. So I will let that be my closing remarks, and Emily, if you wanted to say anything else, but thank you all again so much.
Yeah, just to echo what Teresa said, really great to speak to you all this morning. This morning for me, I don't know, you know, what time it is for you there, but I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and good luck with your research. And yeah, good to speak to you all.